Well, good afternoon. It's wonderful to see you all here for a very special event. I'm Jack McIntyre, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce J. Richard Ciccone, my dear friend and colleague. J. Richard Ciccone, MD, a professor of psychiatry and founding director of the Psychiatry and Law program at the University of Rochester Medical Center, has had a distinguished career. In 2013, Richard received the American Psychiatric Association coveted Isaac Ray Award for his outstanding contributions to forensic psychiatry. Richard has been described as a visionary who has played a crucial role in creating the academic discipline of forensic psychiatry. He was president of the American Academy of Psychiatry and Law and founded the Academy's Forensic Psychiatry course. He was chair of the APA's Commission on Judicial Action for 7 years and subsequently chaired the APA Commission on Public Policy, Litigation, and Advocacy. Richard has published widely and lectured internationally and nationally on forensic psychiatry and ethics, comparative psychiatry, and the history of forensic psychiatry. In 2012, in recognition of his work on behalf of forensic psychiatry and patient advocacy, Richard was awarded an APA Special Presidential Commendation. Today, we all benefit from Richard's and Tina's scholarship and dedication in a different but related area. Giuseppe Ciccone was a remarkable man, and he left us a precious gift. A powerful poem recounting a soldier's, Giuseppe's experience in a brutal and dehumanizing war, and the incredible impact it had on him, as it did on many others. His daughter Tina and grandson Richard painstakingly translated the poem and followed extensively the leads that it presented. Those of you who know Richard know that he doesn't enter a project in a half-baked manner. And his pursuit of the poem, what it meant, the setting and its implications, has been really a tremendous demonstration of scholarship and what can happen when folks apply the scholarship to a particular area. As we will see and hear shortly, Richard pursued it to the battlefields where his grandfather had fought and walked the trenches that still exist from that great war. The work that Tina and Richard did, and as they say in their foreword of the book, in part was to better understand their father and grandfather, who he was and what happened to him during this devastating period of time of World War I. And they have accomplished a tremendous, powerful story, and the story that they tell in terms of their grandfather and father is one that has great meaning for all of us. It's with great delight that I welcome to the stage and to hear from Richard this remarkable story of Giuseppe Ciccone. Richard.
Jack, thank you for that very kind introduction. As I heard John Romano say once, that very kind introduction was something that would have made my father proud, and my mother would have believed it. Welcome to all of you. Welcome, and thank you for coming to this celebration. why are we celebrating this self-published book that translates the experiences of an ordinary man? The first reason is to mark and celebrate a 3.5-year-long effort that Tina and I were engaged in as we tried to make this book a reality. The second reason for the celebration is to acknowledge that this book tells the story of the ordinary soldier and, in its own way, is a universal story. Now, before I tell you the story behind the book and describe the narrative of the poem, there are some people I have to thank. Jamie Zagarowicz, thank you for transforming the manuscript into a computer-compatible, electronically compatible format. When I watch Jamie in front of the keyboard, it's like watching a virtuoso pianist. Keys just, fingers fly all over the keys. And Jared Fisher, thank you for introducing me to Jamie and for encouraging us to work together. Thanks to Ann Williams, who was so supportive and helpful in transcribing many of the versions of this material. Special thanks for editing to our daughter Regina, son-in-law Stephen, our son Louis, his wife Nisha, our son Robert, his wife Christine. Of course, Tina and I take full responsibility for any errors that remain in the text. And as we were going over and draft after draft and draft, and Tina and I were struggling with these drafts, I remembered what Robert told me when I undertook the project. Nothing is perfect. So with that courage, we went ahead. I also have to thank our granddaughter Maggie for providing an afterword to the book. The afternoon that we spent together while she interviewed me about this project is something that I will always cherish. I also want to say a special hi to my other grandchildren, Mary Liz, Tag, Vi, and Zoe. A special thanks to my wife, Natalie. A big special thanks to her, helping me in the translation and editing the text, bringing some music to the translation of the poem, supporting me throughout this 3.5-year-old labor of love, and also for letting me use the dining room table all that time. Now that the project's complete, I'm able to return the dining room table. Now, let me tell you a story. And the story of how I got to know Giuseppe Ciccone, my grandfather, in Italian nonno. So you're going to hear me use the term nonno from time to time. He was a dignified but very distant man who said very little to me when I was a child and then as an adult, as I'll share with you. An ordinary man with a 6th grade education who was a laborer. But more about him in a few minutes. The story of the translation of the book begins in September of 2012. I'm visiting my Aunt Tina in her home outside of Washington, D.C. in Silver Spring. We're seated at the kitchen table, the heart of the home. And after a few minutes, she excuses herself and says, "I'll be right back." And she returns with a small composition notebook, 8 inches by 7.5 inches, that her father, my grandfather, had given to her. He had written in it and presented it to her when she visited Italy in 1971. Tina handed me the notebook and said, "I think you might find this interesting." With Tina's help, I began to read the first few lines, flip through the pages, and I was trying to understand what I was holding. In his distinctive handwriting, he wrote from the top of the page to the bottom of the page. Didn't want to waste any of the paper. And I was looking, and then I saw these numbers. And why are there numbers? And then I began to count the number of lines. And there were 10 lines before and 10 lines after these numbers. said, could this be a poem? And so I began looking at the rhyme scheme. A, B, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. Yes, we had a poem here. But what of this poem? You know, it's a 56-page long epic poem of 112 verses, 10 lines to a verse. This is an extraordinary effort by this ordinary man. We sat reading, translating different passages, jumping ahead. Where was the saga going? He left to go to war, was seriously wounded, returned from battle, quiet, detached, distant. At times, Tina wept as we read and translated the text. It turned out she didn't know much more about this than I did. I was determined to translate my grandfather's epic poem, and by doing so, give this ordinary man, this ordinary silent man, voice. The poem itself, written in Italian, must have been written and rewritten a number of times before it was copied as a final product into the notebook. I don't know when the poem was written, probably after World War I, but before World War II. I contacted the archivist at Cornell. Got a nice logo of Cornell and a little bit of rowing going on. And the archivist did some research and reported back to me that a notebook with this kind of a logo was sold before 1940. How did my grandfather come to have this book? Well, he lived in Ithaca for a number of years, the home of Cornell. I have limited knowledge of Italian and no experience as a poet, but I wasn't going to be daunted, especially with Tina being interested in joining me in this project. She was eager to do it. How to translate from Italian to English? I decided that we should explore translations of Dante's Inferno. And here, from the Cathedral of the Duomo of Florence, we have Michelino's image of Dante. And then here we have souls going into the circles of hell. And here we have purgatory as people make their way up to heaven. We studied 11 translations of Canto 13 of the Divine Comedy. It was clear that each translator, from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1867 to Alan Mendelbaum to John Chardy, each brought his own voice to the words and music of Dante. There was no one way to translate the work. I was encouraged. Since there was no one way, our way would be all right. We decided to use free verse. To make it through the epic poem, we scheduled multiple phone calls, lasting between 1 to 2 hours. Delightful times, and we continue to speak about them. We uncovered a number, as we translated the work, to our surprise, we uncovered a number of historic, mythologic, literary, religious, philosophic, and political references, some of which are discussed in the footnotes of the book. How did he come to such knowledge? This was a man with a 6th grade education. As I describe in the foreword to the book, it turns out that he had a locked trunk. So this man who was locked within himself had a trunk that he kept locked. And what did he keep in the trunk? Books. We know of 3 of the books. 2 of them are Italian classics. Tasso's epic poem, La Gerusalemme Liberata, Jerusalem Delivered, and Tasso's epic poem, and rather Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, The Betrothed, and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, the foundation for Les Mis. I don't know that our book is going to be turned into a musical, but so clearly this ordinary man was well read. Nonno, grandfather, was born in southern Italy in January 1887. So here we have Europe, of course, and the boot, and at the toe of the boot we have the town he was born in, a mountain town not far from Reggio, just outside of Reggio, I should say, in Santa Famia, a town of about 5,000 people. When he was 14 in 1901, like many Italians, he immigrated to the United States. And he made a number of trips over the years, back to Italy, and then back to the United States, back to Italy, back to the United States. In May of 1912, he returned to Santa Famia and married Francesca Pilati, my grandmother. And here they are in May of 71. He's 84 years old, my grandfather is. My grandmother is just a couple of years younger. And they are in the doorway of their home. My grandfather was very proud of his home and doorway, and his initials are there. He's also written a history of the home, and he wrote a history of the town Santa Famia. But those translations are for another time. They had 5 children. My father, Louis, the oldest, Nino, Ursula, Rose, and the youngest, Tina. And in fact, Tina and I are closer in age than Tina and her oldest brother, my dad, Louis. After the birth of my father, my grandfather came back to the United States, because as I said, he went back and forth. But that wasn't an unusual thing for the Italian citizens to do. And my grandmother was one of women that Gay Talese has called white widows. And I quote from Talese's work: "White widows, the wives of ambitious young men who had left the village, at times absent for several years, to make money in America." In November of 1916, my grandfather returned to Italy to join the Italian army. Why did he go back? I consulted the military attaché of the Italian embassy in Washington. He did some research, identified the Italian law that was applicable, and it turned out that any Italian citizen who did not return for service, on returning subsequently to Italy, could be imprisoned. So to avoid being imprisoned, my grandfather returned and joined the army. But that's only part of the story. What was he like prior to World War I? Don't have a lot of information. But my grandmother has reported that he came back a changed man. She had trouble talking with him. At times it didn't make sense. And then she said sometimes she would talk to him about apples, and he responded talking about oranges. World War I was a savagely destructive event, slaughtering millions, wounding millions more, and affecting the souls of many who survived. This is the map of World War I in 1914. You have Britain and France and Russia forming an alliance. Italy joins in 1915. The U.S. joins in 1917. And they are fighting against the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Italy's participation is on the border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The cascading series of events that began on June 28, 1914, started when the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated. And his assassination, in some ways, was accidental. At first, it was planned, and a number of Serbian nationalists got together to assassinate him. They threw a bomb at his car, missed his car, but did hit the car behind his car. People were injured. That upset things, and the Archduke decided, rather than leave the area entirely, that he, following with dignity and protocol, would go to visit the wounded. His driver made a wrong turn down the street and was backing up the car. Cars at that time, when you would back up, might stall, and his car stalled. And the assassin just happened to be there, sitting duck, was the Archduke, and he was killed. For a wonderful description of those days' events and all the events leading to World War I want to commend to you the work of Sean McMeekin, Tom McMeekin's son. His book, July 14, Countdown to War, is an award-winning book. On the Italian front, the war was marked by 12 battles. Let me get you to the battlefield. My grandfather does his basic training in the south, makes his way north, and this is the path he took. It wasn't a convoy of soldiers going north. He was put on the train, and they took the train up north and made their way to the battlefield. Here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire, here's Italy. To give you a sense of the entire battlefield along the Italian-Austro-Hungarian border, you have this border on the west, and the border I'm most interested in is this border because this is where my grandfather fought. They fought between 1914 and 1917, in this case 1915 and 17, over about 10 miles. Back and forth, millions dying over these 10 miles. This is a close-up. Here you see the line in 1914, in this case 1915. This is the Isonzo River. The battles of the Isonzo are named after this river. There are 12 battles. The 10th battle is one that my grandfather participates in that I know about. It is on the Carso, which is a limestone plain. So when people dig ditches in it, they're digging into stone. The brigade that he fought with, the Ferrara Brigade, also fought in the 11th Battle of the Isonzo on this plateau, and in the Battle of Caporetto, which forms the backdrop of Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. A year later, after the first draft of the translation, we had a list of a number of words and phrases that we couldn't translate, didn't have the sense of. But this was the least of our problems. We struggled to capture the meaning of sections of the poem. Sometimes it wasn't translating the word, but what was he trying to say? We decided we had to learn more about World War I and trench warfare. And Natalie and I went to the Carso. We went to Trieste. And I was getting set the next morning to make my way out to the battlefield. And Natalie said to me, "Don't you think we need a guide?" I said, "Yeah, I don't like asking for directions, but I think we'll get a guide." And I went and asked for a guide, and the person who I asked understood what I was trying to do and said, "I have the right person for you," and put me in touch with a guide historian, Paolo Polanzi, who helped Mark Thompson write The White War, a description of World War I along this border. A wonderful man. And so we made our way to the battlefield with him. Here's a photo of soldiers in a trench in 1917. Here's what the trenches look like today. You can get some sense of the scale if you see, here's a ladder to use to climb up. Dug stone holes in the walls to be able to shoot through, areas to rest in or be protected, get some refuge. You get a sense of this, the terrain and the stone of that terrain. Trenches. I thought of trenches as a long line of a trench, and on the other side the enemy had his trench, and you shot at each other. Well, it turns out these trenches were complex systems. You do have a front line trench, but you also have a support trench, and behind that a reserve trench. You have communicating trenches to be able to go back and forth. You have first aid stations. You've got places to sleep, places to eat, latrines, virtual cities, if you will. And here I am in one of the trenches with Paolo. Paolo's from Trieste. His grandfather was from Trieste. Trieste was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His grandfather fought on the other side. So our grandfathers were enemies. I want to assure you, Paolo is a wonderful person. I consider him a dear friend. One of the things that happened as I talked about the story that I had undertaken to translate was people sharing their stories with me. Dan Lestrani told me how his grandfather fought at this front and may well have fought with my grandfather. Steve Van Arsdale's grandfather drove an ambulance for the Italian army. Arlene Vanderlin's grandfather was knighted for his humanitarian work in World War I. Stephanie Brown Clark's family comes from a small town 10 miles from this battlefield. John Tokley's grand uncle was a physician in the Hungarian army. Eric Dreyfus's relatives were physicians in the German army. As I toured the battlefield, we went up one mountain and we found this monument. On this peak, Italian and Hungarian, courageous, if I'd add, enemy combatants became brothers in death. Why did my grandfather decide to write this poem? I think the poem was the result of an unsuccessful effort to heal from the emotional wounds of the war. During World War I, it would have been called shell shock. We now know it as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. In his poem, Nonno does not dwell on the landscape, whether it's his beautiful hometown of Santa Famia or the forbidding battlefield of the Carso. The difficult terrain of the Carso, in fact, is trivial when compared to the treachery he encountered and his struggle to stay alive, at times just to get enough to eat, other times escaping artillery bombardments, planes overhead scraping the area. He uses simple language to convey complex concepts, and we get some glimpses into the private and inner life of one who read, and as far as we know, read alone. In the foreword, I describe 12 major traumas that happened to me during the Battle of the Ozunza. 3 of them occurred in one day over a period of a few hours. He's in one of the trenches. An artillery shell comes nearby, and the trench collapses, and he's buried alive. He has to be dug out by fellow soldiers. Shortly thereafter, he's hit by shrapnel, injured in the thigh and the buttocks. In pain, unable to walk, he gets himself to what he thinks might be a bit of a safe area, and a hand grenade goes off, knocks him unconscious. When he comes to, he writes about the fact that he couldn't see. His story, I think, gets its strength from its simplicity and sincerity. A man returns to his native land, helps to defend it, and what does he find? Corruption, injustice, propaganda, and incompetent leadership on the battlefield, unethical leadership. Leadership has to be ethical, and no more so than on the battlefield. And unethical leadership, they found, leads to a propensity for the development of PTSD. There's only one line in the entire epic poem that he engages in anything resembling self-praise. Wounded and struggling to get the medical attention he needed, he tells us, and I quote, that he, quote, relied on his intelligence and courage to survive. At this point, I'd like to give you a sense of the poem itself and read just a couple of passages. So, he makes his way, to begin with, back to Italy. And he describes leaving to go back. By a twist of fate, near the end of 1916, I left America filled with anguish to do my duty as an honorable Italian citizen. To help my country to glory, I was expected to fill my military obligation. My two brothers were with me. One was especially unfortunate. For me, going to war with Austria resulted in my total ruination. Austrians have the barbarian hearts of assassins. Goes back to Italy, makes his way back to his hometown, and in his hometown, he has a few weeks before he has to report for battle, to basic training, I should say. And he writes, "At night I was preoccupied and could not sleep. I was thinking with much foreboding that in a few days I would have to leave. My fears kept me awake. I was thinking of my wife. In a few days I'd have to leave her. I was thinking of my son and my destiny. I was leaving to go to die. On the 19th of December, my torments began." He makes his way to basic training, and he writes about basic training. "After an hour's walk in the cold and the dark, we arrived at the barracks at a late hour. I was condemned to sleep on the floor like a dog. They gave me a straw mattress and a pillow. The barracks had the stench of a tomb. All night I laid awake. I was thinking of my misfortune. This was the life I had to endure." After basic training, makes his way north on that path that I showed you a little bit ago. And in May of 1917, he's in the Battle of the Isonzo, the 10th battle. The 12th of May arrived, and the Corso was being bombarded. We arrived at the Vallone at 11 p.m. It's a large valley between two big peaks, the Vallone. And the entire regiment came to a halt. Everyone came to understand that the war was our total ruination. There, all we could talk about was the bombardment that went on for 4 days, from morning till night. And that's historically correct. The Italians bombarded the Austrian lines for 4 straight days before the infantry went forth with their assault, which would have included my grandfather. I told my fellow soldiers, "We're all equal. This is what fate has willed. We have to resign ourselves that this is the will of murderous destiny." At midnight on the Faite, one of the mountaintops, I was like a wild animal. 30 people died. At this point, I want to introduce you formally to my Aunt Tina Ciccone-Sturdivant, who received this poem in 1971 in the middle of raising her 4 wonderful children, my cousins, and also pursuing her own career. And in her career, she worked for Montgomery County and headed up the Head Start program. And her work was noted, and she was given many awards, both public and private, for her work in that area. And so, Tina, if you would join me.
Thank you for the kind introduction.
Well, let me give you the microphone.
Good afternoon and welcome. It's so nice to see so many of you take part in this afternoon, which is an amazing afternoon to us. First of all, it's been such a pleasure to work with Richard on this project. As you know, Richard doesn't do things halfway. If he does something, it's done complete. And this afternoon, that really shows the kind of work he does. Let me share something with you. A friend of mine, who is a retired colonel in the United States Army, he fought in two wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. He came over for tea one afternoon, and in the course of the conversation about the book, I said, my father had never talked about the war, never, not even once. And his reply was, Tina, it's known among the officers that soldiers are the ones, when they return to civilian life, they talk about the war. But warriors never do. And me, not knowing very much about this military terminology, I said, what's the difference? A soldier is a soldier. No. He said, a soldier is anyone who is involved in the service. But a warrior is the one who faced the enemy firsthand in combat. So I realized my father was a warrior. He never spoke about the war. But in this book, he talks about the war in such very detailed, amazing way. He was a warrior.
We're going to read a few passages more of the book, and in order for you to hear some of the music of the original, Tina will be reading some sections in the Italian, and I will translate.
Io ero come un cane arrabbiato. Con me c'era un caporale maggiore. De Messina Gallo veniva chiamato. State attento, soldato Ciccone. Io disse tutto sediato. Il ricatto dietro tutto muore. Ci disse io come un lampato. Io ho paura dentro i pantaloni. Da qui dobbiamo tutti e due fuggire.
So he's in the middle of battle, and he says, I was like a mad dog. There was a corporal major with me named Gallo, who was from Messina, a town in Sicily. He said, be alert, Soldier Ciccone. I told him with foreboding, the advancing reinforcements are all going to die. Then I told him like one lit up by lightning, I'm scared to death, we all have to get out of here. The lieutenant pointed his rifle at me. I responded, Lieutenant, with all due respect, I beg you to put down your rifle. At this moment, I am not thinking about my life. Save yourself. You do not want to die. Here the fires of hell are ablaze. The lieutenant demanded, you have to obey my orders. I said to him insolently, I'll think about it. He replied, when we get back, I'm going to bring you up on charges. The enemy fired at him with a machine gun. He died in the hospital with 17 bullets in him.
That's what we read. That's one we read.
Yeah.
Oh, where I find this line always extremely moving. It says, oh, where tu veniste a bestemmiare, il carso è tutto fuoco del cannone, è tutto scoperto quanto si vede, dal dosso ferito a Monfalcone. Questa è guerra di morire per due infami imperatori. Di ogni parte aggiustavo le tire, pareva scuro e molto calore. L'ascia infame e vendicativa, il carso fu la mia rovina.
O war, You came and transformed us into beasts. The Carsos of flame from artillery fire, from the Dorso Faite, a mountaintop, to Falcone, Mount Falcone, which is a town. As far as you can see, there's no cover. This is a war of total death, caused by two evil emperors. From everywhere, the Austrians are adjusting the aim of their artillery. The battlefield was dark and very hot. Infamous and vindictive Austria, the Carso was my ruin. And the difference between the participant and the historian might say a blue-green haze covered the battlefield. He's in it, and he says the battlefield was dark and very hot.
Mi mise sopra con molti lamenti. Dopo 2 ore arrivo all'ospedale. Mariano il paese si voleva chiamare. Là c'erano molti morenti, medici passati capitani. Sentiva gridare tanta gente, pareva che scannano i maiali. Il direttore era calabrese, doveva essere bruciato dentro la pece.
I was in great pain as they put me in the ambulance. After 2 hours, we arrived at the hospital, having experienced many dangers and many problems. The hospital was located in the town of Mariano. At the hospital, there were many attendants and doctors who were higher in rank than captain. I could hear many wounded soldiers screaming. It sounded like a slaughterhouse. The director of the hospital was from Calabria. He deserved to be burned in pools of boiling pitch. That sounds like something that could be from Dante's Inferno. How am I going to find it? It's huge text. Google to the rescue. I put the lines in, and in 0.2 of a second it came up. It was from Canto 22, in the 8th circle of hell, where Dante finds demons tormenting those who abuse their power or position to enrich themselves by placing them in boiling pitch. And I think we can all think of a few folks we might like to put in boiling pitch. Then he goes on to say the doctors were like butchers. They were severing arms and legs left and right. There was a mountain of torment. From throughout the hospital you could hear screams. Some called on the Holy Mother. Others were begging St. Joseph for help. It was a hospital for the dying. The hospital was called 031. I was there for 3 months, but did not fully recover. In March of 1968, to mark the 50th anniversary of the end of World War I, the Italian government established the Order of Vittorio Veneto with the rank of knight to honor soldiers who had been given the Croce, or the Cross of War. In March of 1971, when he was 84, my grandfather received his certificate and his medals. So here he is at 84 years of age. You see him wearing his medals. Here's his certificate. I've had this certificate in my office for a number of years, and I saw, oh, he was Cavaliere. Isn't that nice? Well, that means knight. So he was knighted, and with Natalie's help, and a magnifying glass, we were able to identify these medals. And on eBay, we were able to find them and buy them. So in the reception, you're going to see the photo, the medals, the certificate. All too often, history focuses on the kings and the generals. And here we have a mosaic from the National Archaeological Museum of Naples that depicts the battle between Alexander the Great and the Persian king Darius. And you see center stage, the king, larger than the horse. Around are soldiers who are fighting, wounded, fallen. In my grandfather's epic poem, it's the soldier who takes center stage. The soldier throughout history, from the Trojan War to the Vietnam War to Iraq and Afghanistan. The fact that this is the story of an ordinary soldier is what makes it special and makes it universal. We all have our stories to tell. All our families have their stories to tell. And all of them are important and they deserve to be told. The feelings, the fears, the injuries of this World War I soldier transcend time and location. The poem, as I mentioned, I think was his personal effort to heal from PTSD and to connect with his wife, his children, his grandchildren, the world. I wish I could have spoken with him about this, but he couldn't do it. When we visited in August of 1973, there we are with him. It was just pleasant, quiet, not sharing. This picture taken at that time, Lewis was about a year and a half at the time, is as close to a smile that I ever saw him have on his face. He was distant, hard to communicate with, but I thank him profoundly for the gift of this poem. Thank you for your kind attention. We did it. We did it. Now, thank you. We have time for a couple of questions, so if there are any questions that you'd like to ask, we'd be delighted to entertain them. Professor Hazal. It's beyond my expertise. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The question was, there is a tradition of war poetry, and Sassoon is one, and of course Winfred Owens is another, and of course the French have their tradition of the World War I poetry. I'm not familiar with the Italian tradition of war poetry, so I wish I knew more. It's another one of those avenues that I wish I had time and had explored. Tim. Yes. I had mentioned that my grandfather went back and forth to Italy and to the United States, and Tim is asking, was it always to Ithaca? It was not always to Ithaca. In fact, you can, just talking about his going back and forth to Italy, you can know when he went back and forth to Italy by the spacing of his children. There were times that he lived in Rochester. I never knew he lived in Rochester, but he was here in 1907. I found that out after I came here to train, and my father then told him about it, and so yes, I lived there. He also lived in other communities in Auburn, New York, and I know of Ithaca. When he first came over, he was in New York City for a brief period of time. So it was always in New York State and usually in upstate New York. In 1933, he returned to Italy, and he was an anti-fascist. Not a very healthy thing to be in Italy at that time. And he learned that they were going to be coming to arrest him. So he had his family bring his clothes trunk to the train station while he sat around the village square. And then he said to folks there, "Oh, I'll be right back." And he left, and he went to the train station, and he didn't return for about 30 years. And he said he would not return until all the fascists were gone. And then he retired to Italy at the end of his life here. My grandmother retired there. Liz. Liz is asking what my grandfather did during World War II. He was here in the United States. My grandmother, my Aunt Rose, and my Aunt Ursula and Aunt Tina were in Italy, and I'll give the mic to my Aunt Tina for a second. I had 5 uncles who fought in the American Army. Uncle Frank, who was a physician in the Army. My uncle Nino was D-Day +1. He never spoke about his experiences in World War II. He made his way ultimately through France and down into Italy, and then came to the hometown of Santa Fe, not having had much communication for many, many years. And let you talk about that experience.
Yes, we did have a communication for a number of years during the war. And then suddenly, one evening, he arrived. This American soldier. And it was very, very, very exciting times, really. Let me go back a step to a previous question. The last trip that came, the trip that I made in the 30s back to the United States, as Richard said, was a necessity, was forced in a way because of the fascism. And during that period, there would be a knock at the door in the middle of the night, and the people were taken never to be seen again. So it was somewhat known that he may be arrested. So they had a family meeting, as Richard mentioned. They had a family meeting, and they felt he should get away. They only were to go. Because he had been in the United States before, he felt that's a logical place to go to. So in secret, deep secret, he left and he came to the United States. But must have been something really amazing to meet his friends in the public square, the way men used to meet those days, a circle of friends. And after a standard, normal conversation, for him to say, "Excuse me," and he left. They thought he would come back in a few minutes. And he went to the station very quickly. His luggage was already there. And he made a trip to the United States, and he was saved from the fascism. Otherwise, we don't know how it would have ended, and probably I won't be here today.
His departure was known in the town as the Saccone goodbye. Now, we run out of time at this point, but afterwards, Tina and I will be available. It's our pleasure to give you copies of the book today at the reception. We just ask you to consider making a contribution to a veterans organization. A local organization that I'm very familiar with and does wonderful work is Veterans Outreach of Rochester. The kind of services it provides to veterans, I think, would have benefited my grandfather. So we'll stop here, but Tina and I are eager to chat with you, to meet you, to give you copies of the book, and answer whatever questions we can. Again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We did it. So we'll see you at the reception.